What we're doing here is EAB Field Day, so this is our second of 6 days that we're doing this. So the idea is to get people a chance to have some hands-on time sampling trees infested with EAB. Probably about 70 trees in St. Paul that we've identified as we're pretty suspicious they have EAB. Those are identified this winter. And so those are the trees that are being used for the training. So we wanted to have trees here that we'd have a pretty high probability of finding EAB in.
Welcome to Why Trees Matter. I'm John Lloyd with the Urban Forestry Institute, and our guest today is Mark Abrahamson of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and he is also an associate professor with the Urban Forestry Institute. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here.
Mark is the one who was responsible for developing a plan of action for emerald ash borer that was supposed to be here in the next 10 to 20 years. And unfortunately, we found it in St. Paul, and since that time, Mark's world has been turned upside down. So what exactly happened on that one day when you got the phone call that said, I think we found emerald ash borer?
Well, that was a big surprise because actually just a month before that, emerald ash borer was discovered in Victory, Wisconsin, which is just outside of southeastern Minnesota. So when I got the phone call from a Rainbow employee, it was, we were actually down in southeastern Minnesota doing a survey for emerald ash borer there. And then with the description I got over the phone, it sure sounded like the real thing. So we headed back up that night. And the next morning, unfortunately, it was emerald ash borer. So we've been, it's been pretty crazy since then.
And you've worked very closely with the city of St. Paul in mitigation efforts. Can you kind of describe what the Department of Ag's approach is to this issue?
The Department of Ag's role is really from the detection and regulatory angle, traditionally. So I mean, our main role is to find emerald ash borer in new areas and quarantine those areas so that it's not getting spread through commerce or other types of movement to new areas. Now in the case with emerald ash borer, since this is a pretty new thing, we've been involved a little bit beyond those traditional roles to where we're working with cooperators to try and you know, I guess assist them with efforts they might be making to try and mitigate the problem. So really our role in that sense has been kind of an advisory one. We don't really have any mandates that we're making upon cities that they have to take one course of action or another. The only thing we've really mandated is that, you know, there's a quarantine that's been established and the rules of that have to be followed. Beyond that, you know, in terms of St. Paul or any of these other cities, it's more of an advisory role where we, you know, basically provide them the information they need to make a decision on what they're going to do, and then try and work with them to support their efforts, you know, regardless of the course they take. And I think we're pretty fortunate with where EAB has been discovered, that we've had some great cooperation with St. Paul and also with other cities affected in the area. And man, that's a huge plus.
Now, prior to this, you were actually establishing an EAB First Responders program. Mm-hmm. That was a Minnesota Department of Agriculture initiative. Can you explain what that's about and where that is now? Yeah,
that's something that it's actually a federal program that we tapped into. It's called the First Detector Network. And so in Minnesota, we've kind of tailored it a little bit differently. Maybe usually it's kind of a general thing where you teach people how, if they find something weird, how do they collect the sample and where do they submit it and how. We tried to take that in Minnesota and really tailor it towards, in the case of emerald ash borer, tree people, and make it a fairly specific training. So they got lots of information about emerald ash borer, lots of diagnostic information in terms of how to recognize things. And then of course, what do you do if you found it? You know, how do you take a sample and how do you submit it? But boy, things went exactly as you might have hoped they would. You know, the arborist first noticed the damage one afternoon. By the next afternoon, samples had been taken, photographs submitted to APHIS. They'd given us a confirmation and we were able to release information. So that's about as quick a turnaround as you can hope for. So I think we feel pretty good about how that's gone. And I think, you know, to some degree that, you know, that network maybe has played a role in that. It certainly has been a big plus for us in trying to handle public reports of emerald ash borer. Most new finds of emerald ash borer are not by the formal surveys that we do, the purple traps and the detection trees and things like that. Most of the time, they're trees that are found by just somebody in the public who happens to come across an infested tree. And so having that network of people out there who have had some training in how to distinguish emerald ash borer from other things, and then what do you do if you think it is emerald ash borer, it helps tremendously in dealing with the number of calls we get from the public now about emerald ash borer. We had almost 2,000 calls last year of people suspecting emerald ash borer. There's no way we could have dealt with those without that network of people.
And you're working with University of Minnesota Extension as well as the Department of Natural Resources?
Yeah, exactly. So it's been a real collaborative effort between MDA, University of Minnesota Extension, and DNR to put that training together and then to deliver it. And we actually started that in 2008 was the first year that we did first detector training for emerald ash borer, and we've repeated it in 2009 and 2010.
And so these are the folks that actually, if you get a call in and it sounds suspicious, then you send the first responders out to do the identification.
When we get a call, we have people go through a checklist that kind of gives them some comment, like, for instance, is it really an ash tree? And then if it makes it through all those checks, then it ends up going to a first detector. So of that, we almost got 2,000 calls. We had just a little over 200 that actually ended up getting to a first detector.
What is the number that people can contact if they actually think that they found emerald ash borer?
Yeah, well, we've got a hotline number that is 888, and I don't remember the rest of the numbers. So
okay, well,
might have to edit that back in or something.
Yeah, we can put that in the bottom.
Yeah.
We'll put that down.
Yeah.
Website though.
Yeah, website. Yeah, the best way to get our website, because of course the address is about 200 characters long, is to just type into a search engine like Google Minnesota emerald ash borer, and one of the first sites you'll get back is Department of Ag's page.
And that's where people can report if they have a...
Yep, our contact information is there. So what I prefer most is email. If people send us an email, Arrest the Pest is our email address. And we also have information right at our website. So the best thing to do if you suspect emerald ash borer is do a little investigation on your own. Check out the website. There's a checklist on there called Do I Have EAB? And that will take you through a few steps. Make sure that it is an ash tree. Make sure that it's not a lookalike. Make sure that everything's consistent. And if you go through that checklist, there's a number right on there for the first detector hotline. So they can go right to that and get somebody to look at their tree if it looks like the real thing. People who are doing surveys would look for our trees that are suspect for emerald ash borer. And the best way to find those is by woodpecking and by bark splits. So that's really what our inspectors look for. What we found is that during the summer, we spent some time looking for trees with decline and had trees picked out as suspect that way. Very few of those trees that we picked out that way turned out to have emerald ash borer, and this is right around in that initial area. What we found since then is that a lot of the trees that we've been able to identify this winter, not by looking for decline, but looking for woodpecking and bark splits, most of those do in fact have emerald ash borer, so it seems to be a lot better indicator looking for those rather than decline. You know, the thing to keep in mind though is that a tree that has woodpecker damage or has some splitting bark, that isn't necessarily diagnostic for emerald ash borer. You got to dig a little deeper. So usually what we're looking for is then, you know, beneath that area of damage, you look for the diagnostic gallery of emerald ash borer, which is this back and forth serpentine gallery that's very distinctive. And you know, you really have to see it to get a mental image for it, because a lot of times I'll have people tell me about the tunnels they're seeing in an ash tree and they're sure that it's emerald ash borer, but then when you describe the shape to them, then you know it's clear that it isn't. So there are other insects that will be found in an ash tree perhaps, but EAB is really distinctive within the tree from those others.
What is your perspective on what the next few years are going to be like now that it's here, it's expanding out? I mean, there's no way we can really delineate and remove all the infested trees, so it's something that's going to be here forever.
Yeah.
What is your perspective? What do you think is going to be happening in the next 5, 10, even 15 years?
In St. Paul, when it was found by the arborist, there were no dead trees present yet. You know, it was a pretty early stage yet. So we're earlier in the curve than other places have been. We also have going for us some great cooperators in terms of St. Paul and these other cities that are taking aggressive steps to get rid of infested trees. You know, and other things that would work to kind of slow down the population growth. So it's possible that we're going to be in better shape than we've seen elsewhere. It's also possible that all these things aren't going to make a bit of difference, and we're going to see exactly the same thing happen here as has happened elsewhere, which is an epidemic wave of ash mortality. So what we're really trying to do is make sure that we're collecting the data that will allow us to evaluate those things, so that 5 years from now we can compare what's happened here to what's happened in Michigan or Illinois or somewhere else, and we have a feel for, have these things. Maybe it's not real easy to tell exactly what's made a difference, but is there a difference here than somewhere else? One of the strategies for reducing emerald ash borer population growth is to reduce the amount of host available to it. Got an area of trees that are kind of ripe for removal anyway. You take those out of there. Now in that area, it's much less susceptible to damage from emerald ash borer because there's fewer trees for it to build up on that you've got to deal with if it is discovered in that area.
What are you doing throughout state? Because I know at one point you had traps located in campgrounds throughout the area because the fear was that it would be coming in on firewood.
Right. And that, we may still find an infestation that's somewhere else in the state that's been there for 6 years. We found this one early, but that certainly doesn't mean that there aren't others that have come from wherever. So the next one we find, be it in St. Cloud or Rochester or Duluth, it doesn't necessarily have to have come from St. Paul. It may have come from Michigan, 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my approach, is that we know about what we find, but what we haven't found, we don't know about. So that kind of remains to be seen. Really, our survey effort is more directed towards outside of the quarantine. So we're working to try and support our cooperators inside the quarantine, but really our main survey focus is more detecting new pockets outside of there, so we can kind of start the same actions, in that area.
Can you explain a little bit about the quarantine? What actually does the quarantine do for it's for both Hennepin and Ramsey County?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So for the Twin Cities, it encircles Hennepin and Ramsey, and then we also have a quarantine around Houston County in southeastern Minnesota. Okay. And the purpose of the quarantine is to prevent long-distance movement of infested material. So that's been a big driver of EAB movement around the country, is that it can fly, but it can't fly 200 miles from Michigan to another place. So it's been moved around the country in firewood and other types of wood, and potentially even in ash nursery stock. And so the purpose of that is to stop that movement. So now that we know we have infested trees in Hennepin and Ramsey counties, we know we're never going to find them all. So there's always, the risk that a tree that's not known to be infested is going to be removed and it's going to be turned into firewood or something else and taken somewhere. So the quarantine is meant to stop that movement. And really, the quarantine is probably easiest to implement on businesses, because businesses are identifiable. You know what their business practices are. You've got someone you can speak to. You can explain what's happening. It's a lot more difficult to deal with the general public on a quarantine issue. And unfortunately, with emerald ash borer, a lot of these materials are very easily moved by the general public, particularly firewood. So in that case, we don't have guards, standing at the borders of the quarantine. We're pretty much relying on trying to get the information out to people, having them understand what's going on, and then follow through on not moving those things. Part of the unfortunate business with this quarantine is that emerald ash borer can only move in ash. It only infests ash. It's not going to move in any other type of wood. But because the average person is probably not able to easily distinguish ash from oak from elm firewood, all hardwood firewood is included in the quarantine. So regardless of what you might think you have, legally you can't take hardwood firewood out of a quarantine to somewhere else. Okay.
Now you can still bring firewood into the quarantine area.
Absolutely. As
long as it's not from Michigan or Chicago.
Right. Or it's not from another quarantine area. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for being here today. Yeah. And thank you for watching Why Trees Matter. Why Trees Matter is brought to you by the Urban Forestry Institute. Our speaker today was provided by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Today's program was sponsored by Rainbow Tree Care Companies, Science, Service, and Satisfaction.